There's way too much of this. Since the 15th century, indisputable, unfathomable amounts of atrocities were perpetrated on indigenous peoples by European settlers, North American governments, and churches. And while the symptoms of past transgressions are still evident today, what's truly unbelievable is the cruelty continues, only now in modern form through political, legal, and social systems. But I'm here to propagate a very different idea, to tell you change is coming. Something very exciting is brewing. A new generation of indigenous peoples, all professions, including cooks and chefs, whose indomitable spirits and drive to effect change are doing some wonderful things. And this is just the beginning. This episode, we're going to break Bannock and hear personal stories from two different First Nations peoples. First, we're headed to Kensington Market, which is more bohemian neighborhood than market. A vibrant enclave impervious to the condo developments and restaurant chains swallowing up the rest of the downtown core. It's quite befitting a place for a cafe whose owner, Shawn, has a roll up his sleeves, I don't give a fuck what the world throws at me attitude. And maybe that mental hardness had something to do with the adversity he faced with his half-Jewish, half-Anishinaabe upbringing.
I come from two oppressed peoples. On one side, my family went through the Holocaust, and on the other side, my family went through residential schools. Me, I think I'm just a happy-go-lucky guy.
One of Shawn's labors of love, Powwow Cafe. Powwow is a word used by many indigenous communities to refer to sacred social gatherings. But somewhere along the line, think old Western movies, the word was hijacked and its meaning desecrated. And it's highly offensive when used in the wrong context. You've heard it. Let's have a powwow in the meeting room. Real powwows include prayers, stunningly beautiful regalia, celebratory food, drums, and dancing. And oh, the dancing. Fancy dancers move with such physical prowess, they make Zumba look like Wednesday night line dancing at the nursing home. Chef Shawn Adler is restoring sanctity to the word, bringing awareness to traditional powwow food, and jazzing it up with as many twists and turns as a fancy dancer. So powwow food, how would you describe it? It's not like you're sitting down eating a dish, it's more grab on the go, walk around.
Walk around or, sit in a lawn chair and watch the dancing and the drumming. I've just developed a style of cooking over the years. I take food that I grew up eating, like smoked duck, bologna, I just infuse it with indigenous inspiration. Yeah, that's what we're known for here. I call it like it's contemporary indigenous cuisine. It's based on foods that are basically from this region. Like at Powwow we serve quite a bit of venison, quite a bit of rabbit, pickerel, perch. It really depends on the week, but
The arrival of the European settlers disrupted the traditional diet so drastically, indigenous food practices traditionally passed down orally were pushed to the brink of extinction systematically. In Canada, policies under the Indian Act, reserves, residential schools, and 60 scoops were intended to erase all things indigenous. Next, we're headed to the longest running indigenous restaurant in Toronto. And what we're gonna hear is quite appalling. Let's learn of the experience of one Thomas Norton, a man birthed in the Saugeen Nation who's surprisingly jovial despite the traumatic events in his life. Now a cook at To Tea N Bannock, a Toronto restaurant amongst other things.
I'm part of the 60 Scoop. It's probably been about 7 years, I guess now. The 60 Scoop was, 1 minute you're there and the next minute you're not.
You heard of residential schools, but you may not have heard about the 60 Scoop. It coined a period from 1960 through 1980 where 20,000 indigenous children were forcibly taken from their biological families, lands, and culture, and trafficked, not just in Canada, but around the world, and raised in white middle-class households. A continuation of the legacy of the residential school system, aggressive assimilation, and cultural genocide.
I had 10 brothers and sisters. Some of them since died, and I'm not sure how many are left now. I think there's 4 of us. And we all joined the class action suit. They were forced to have to pay out $25,000 to each of us.
I'm sure the PM and all his cabinet members would be okay if they were paid that amount of money for their children to be taken away.
I was actually taken when I was about 3 months old. I was put up for adoption at that age. I tend to think of myself as one who walks in both worlds, meaning I'm native, but I'm also, because I grew up in the non-native world, I know more of that world than I do of my own heritage and culture. So it took years later to kind of figure out, okay, yes, I'm native, but what does that mean?
So you're mixing a lot of pre-contact ingredients with post-contact. You're mixing the two.
Yep,
right?
absolutely. You're
not biased against that.
We don't play rules. Favorites really. Like, well, maybe we do. But yeah, like I love cooking with things like chocolate and bananas and everything. I don't want to like rule out anything in my cooking. It's based in Powwow Foods, so scone dogs, corn soup, fry bread. Like there's a basis in contemporary Indigenous cuisine. If you're decolonizing your diet, obviously you're not eating fry bread. Right. But like I grew up eating fry bread.
It's nostalgic.
Yeah, like I grew up eating fry bread. My mom grew up eating fry bread. My grandmother, my Nokomis.
Yeah.
So it's like,
it's not like you're eating it every day.
No, I don't.
Right? It's like
I don't advocate that anybody should do that. But at the same time, it's delicious, and it's like Indigenous ingenuity. Really, is what it is. The bread of oppression. At the same time, it's delicious.
So your specific First Nation, what was it? It was in Thunder Bay, right?
Just outside of Thunder Bay, Lac First Nation.
What was the population there?
Oh wow, I think our band membership's somewhere around 600 right now.
600. Okay, so small to medium size.
Yeah, but there's no real community there now because it was flooded twice by hydro.
See, you don't hear about those things happening in non-reserve areas, eh?
Oh, flooding people's land?
Flooding.
No,
you heard about that,
yeah.
right?
You would hear about it.
You would hear about it. Yeah. It's crazy. This happens all too often. When developments by non-Indigenous groups encroach or even devastate Indigenous reserves and reservations, there doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency. But the other way around, and well, there's an uproar.
Try that one. So this is our soda company. So we call it Wild Side Soda Company. Nice. This is a cedar, sweetgrass. We have a few other flavors.
Cheers. How do you say cheers in? Cheers. Oh wow.
It's nice, eh?
I love the crunchy exterior, and it's so moist inside. Yeah, that's delicious. Wow, they're all good. Like, you're blowing my mind. Oh, the yolk is still intact, Shawn. You're evil, Shawn. What issues or what barriers are there to achieving food sovereignty these days?
Yeah, so like food politics is something that I'm inevitably wrapped up in because I'm a chef, right? Here at Powwow, we try to support as much Indigenous businesses as possible. So like
By buying off
Indigenous companies. What you're gonna see more and more is more Indigenous companies sort of popping up. Same reason why like there's Indigenous chefs now that are successful. It's like, I'm the first generation not to go to residential school. So how can you possibly have food sovereignty when like the whole process of residential schools was to like take away the knowledge of your food, right? Like the government realized that you are what you eat. There's a lot of problems, but what I think is like now that we're in this generation that we didn't attend residential schools, we can be proud of who we are. We can take our knowledge and we can use it. I'm opening a restaurant. Amber Robe, all these Indigenous chefs are opening restaurants. There's Indigenous musicians now. Now they're winning Polaris Prize in Canada. You know, there's Indigenous politicians, there's Indigenous lawyers, doctors, and that's all within this generation, basically.
This resurgence Shawn talks about gets me hopeful, kind of. Although many of the barbarous institutions have shut their doors, any future actions have to be rooted in compassion, where we care for the well-being of each other like family members. And that drives meaningful change. And North America, well, let's just keep a positive attitude and not give up.
So when people ask me about culture and whatnot, I'm just basically passing on what I've learned through other people. None of us who grew up and had access to our culture, we're now left struggling with what's the language, how do you talk with the language, how do you, what are the oral traditions of our region, what are the recipes that were handed down. So when you have something like the 60 Scoop and you have residential schools on top of that, you're talking multi-generations which have lost all of their ability to be that person, that native person. And so the next generation, because that one generation has lost its ability, they can't teach this generation of the history and the oral traditions because they don't know it. It was taken away from them. We're the only race in Canada who has to live under what's called the Indian Act. If people had to live under a certain act here in Canada, they'd be furious.
Could you imagine having an act that defines who you are? Imagine the Italian Act, Chinese Act.
Do you harbor any resentments towards what's happened in the past, like towards the settlers, if you will? Or...
I've learned I'm not going to sit and wallow in despair just because, I may have been beaten as a child or whatever, because that's not going to get me anywhere that I need to be.
Right.
And I think that, as hard as it is to do that for certain individuals, that's something that you have to be able to reach within yourself to be able to overcome. And if you can do that, then you can go on and be the person that you want. But am I angry? I'm pissed off. I'm angry in that it shouldn't have happened. If I could go back, maybe I'd burn their ships before they reached the harbors.
Welcoming with open arms and trading fur with them.
Yeah.
Right? Are we moving forward in Canada with reconciliation, all the steps?
I think we are. I think we're at the point where a number of Canadians now understand that we're not just talking out of our mouths to hear ourselves talk. When we can produce and show that there were 1,500 dead children buried on a school lot, that's the wake-up call that Canada got.
You're from the Saugeen Nation specifically, right? So it's almost a misnomer to say there's Indigenous food, because that's like saying all Asian food's the same. Right, because there's over 600 First Nations. They all have their different languages, different foods. What is specific to your nation in terms of the food? What are the flavor profiles?
My reserve back in the would have been, I guess, the 70s and the 80s. We were still practicing that, and we had huge fields of tobacco. In terms of the food, for our particular reserve, I would say there would have been game. And mostly fish, because you have Lake Huron that's right there.
Right.
While talking, we tucked into traditional foods that bore resemblance to dishes eaten today, with an indigenized take. Bison acted as a replacement for beef in burgers and stir-fry, slightly gamey. White fish lightly breaded, served with an accompaniment of wild rice and coleslaw. I'm grateful for Thomas to share his story with us, and for Tea N Bannock for letting us break Bannock together. I feel this is how easy it is. Replace one or two ingredients with something different, and that makes us question what we're eating and where things come from, and maybe to go a little deeper into things that connect us. I'm ready to explore more of the history and try more foods that I know nothing about. Next episode, we're headed down to the Six Nation Reserve to talk with Haudenosaunee chef Tanya Brandt, who is decolonizing diets of her community.